Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 1st of April 1923, just to demonstrate how much the world has moved on in the last century, we'll be doing housing, cycle safety, air pollution in the cities, Ulster's customs control, drugs and immigration, as well as a few other things. In a change to the usual format of these things, what I'm going to do is mainly go through each day of the week, because that just happens to be how things have panned out. Although there is one story that's made the news and has been quite big this week, which is that the Soviet Union has sentenced to death a Roman Catholic archbishop, which has certainly made a big fuss. In the end, they decided that it might be a better idea to commute that sentence to life imprisonment. As it happens, the archbishop concerned, whose name I forget, fortunately because I can't pronounce it, was actually got out about a year later. Right, so Monday, on Monday the Times was reporting on the National Cyclist Union, who had some sort of conflab. This is what they resolved: that the frequent road accidents caused by the dazzling headlights of some motor vehicles, and on the other hand the inefficient lights of other vehicles, demand the urgent attention of the transport authorities, with a view to a minimum and a maximum standard of lighting being set up, which, while enabling drivers to see where they were driving, would not at the same time so dazzle other road users as to endanger their safety. A problem, of course, that lasts to this day. On Saturday, Lord Montague of Bewley, who was pretty much the self-appointed spokesman of motorists, did suggest 3 different schemes. One was that it should be able to, or should be possible, for lights to be dimmed. Another, that a blind should descend over the lens so that it was effectively dipped when the motorist came across oncoming traffic. And the other was that windscreen should have a piece of blue glass at about eye level, which apparently would reduce any glare without diminishing visibility. Of course, the fun thing, or the interesting thing to me, is that none of these schemes was the one that solved the problem. Of course, a modern car, or at least my car, has 2 lights: one main beam, one dip beam, and both are under separate lenses, which you are supposed to select accordingly, which, let's face it, for the most part, people do. It goes on. The Union reaffirmed its opposition to any attempt to impose rear lights on cyclists, and expressed the opinion that if any warning sign at all was needed, a reflector or similar device would be more practical than a lighted lamp. Well, that they may have thought that, but they lost. Well, certainly in this country, if you cycle at night, you must, if I remember the law correctly, have both front and rear lights and front and rear reflectors. Of course, that's not the law everywhere, as I discovered when I was on holiday in British Columbia some 30-odd years ago. And the law there is you had to have a single rear light, but not a front light. The consequence of which was that it was actually impossible to buy a front light because demand was so low. But the National Cyclist Union, by the way, that's not a name I'm familiar with. I wonder what happened to them. It's possible they became the Cyclist Touring Club, which was the main sort of cyclists organisation that I knew of. Possible, but otherwise maybe they just became defunct. Anyway, they have a further resolution, and that was that the present penalties for the driving of motor and other vehicles by drivers under the influence of liquor are entirely inadequate, and that the government be urged to introduce legislation at an early date which would render the offenders liable to a heavy fine and or imprisonment and suspension of licence. I must confess I find this very puzzling, because hardly a week goes by in which the Times does not cover an example of a drunk driver who does indeed incur a heavy fine and has his licence suspended for a period. So I'm not quite sure what the National Cyclists Union is complaining about. Oh, by the way, I did find it interesting that the use of the word liquor. In England these days, in British English, that is a word that's very rarely used. To the extent that it's almost as if you're pretending to be an American if you use the word. So it's interesting that the word has sort of fallen into disuse, at least on this side of the Atlantic. In the same edition of the Times, they covered a conference on smoke abatement. This is not something I've spoken much about yet. So far this year, there have been 2 smogs, to the best of my knowledge, and certainly the first one led to a definite increase in the death rate. But it certainly doesn't seem as bad as the Great Smog of 1952, which ended in the Clean Air Act and essentially the banning of burning coal and wood in the capital. Anyway, a Professor Bone said, "It should be realised, however, by those who are responsible for the introduction of legislation, that they would, unless the very greatest care was taken, imperil the industry in this country and absolutely ruin the commercial efficiency of trade." The article continued. Mr. Baker, the chairman of the Sheffield Employers' Organisations, then stated the case especially for the Sheffield's trades. He lodged a report, which had been signed by all the firms engaged in the steel industry, pointing out the absolute impracticability of eliminating smoke with the knowledge at their present disposal. It continues, "Unless the government understood this, the whole of the Sheffield steel trade, which was suffering such severe unemployment, would be jeopardised." Well, of course it was jeopardised in the end, which is why there is no longer a Sheffield steel trade. Whether it was pollution legislation that did it or was part of the story, I don't know. A letter from a Captain Coe caught my eye. This is what he has to say. "The patent increase of drug addiction has coincided with the increase of restrictive legislation in all directions. It is at least possible that its growth is a symptom of a peculiar neurosis known, I believe, to experts as the nervousness of suppression. In short, it is in all probability part and parcel of a cumulative succession of attempts on the part of the legislature, extending over half a generation, to enforce morality by acts of Parliament. Or, to put it another way, people do it not despite the fact it's illegal, but because it's illegal." I mean, although it does make me wonder what he means about what are these other acts he's talking about. I mean, certainly in the First World War there was an attempt to reduce drinking, and I believe in the 19th century, which is rather more than half a generation ago, there was a crackdown on prostitution. But I can't think of anything else he could be talking about here. Now, in real life, you've probably, well, certainly if you're British, you'll be aware of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, what this was part of the process in which the UK left the European Union, and part of the motivation for it was that Britain really, really, really didn't want to be creating any border infrastructure in Ireland, or on the border with the Republic of Ireland, for good reason, because this is precisely the sort of infrastructure that would be likely to be attacked if there was a resumption of a campaign by the Irish Republican Army. And indeed, the last time I crossed the border, which would have been about 5 years ago, well, there's nothing there either way. Well, that was not how they felt about things in 1923, because there has been an announcement that Ulster will be building some customs posts on the border. Also on Monday, there was an editorial about what the Times called skeleton legislation. Now, what the complaint is that a lot of legislation was being passed by Parliament, which was very vague and allowed a great deal of leeway for ministers and civil servants. This is a quotation from that article. Lord Cousins Hardy, when Master of the Rolls, made a protest against the system, pointing out that administrative action generally meant something done by a man whose name they did not know, sitting at a desk in a government office, very apt to be a despot if free from the interference of the courts of justice. I suppose these days that sort of despotism is carried out by quangos. On Tuesday, there was a libel case, or the Times reported on a libel case. A very odd one. There was a famous singer involved. Phyllis Lett, I think is her name. She was a famous singer, and lots of recordings were issued in her name. And some record publisher has found some old recordings of her voice, of her singing, apparently before she got good at it, or before she was famous, and have released them. And apparently this is worthy of a libel case. But my goodness, she's got a really good witness for her. That's Sir Edward Elgar. So well done her. The Football Association has a few things to say. It's decided it wants to change the rules of the game. This will include substitutes, a 10-yard rule for when a free kick is taken, and also, I thought this was an interesting one, players to be outside the penalty area at free kicks. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The thing I was curious about reading this is that it was the Football Association doing this and not the International Football Association Board, which, to the best of my knowledge, was and still is officially, it's really FIFA, the setter of the rules. So I'm not quite sure what that was all about. Maybe it was a case the FA just told the IFAB what to do, as indeed FIFA does these days. Also on Tuesday, there was a case of a coal owner who, he fell out of a train and died. And then there was this, which is really rather ominous. Members who have been concerned at the growing huskiness of Mr. Bonar Law's voice were disappointed to find that the weekend rest had not done him so much good as had been hoped. At question time yesterday, he was almost entirely inaudible. It is stated that the Prime Minister is suffering from a relaxed throat, but that his health otherwise is good. Well, it isn't. This is a symptom of the throat cancer that will force him to step down as Prime Minister very soon and will kill him later on in the year. Well, there you go. You spend 10 years as leader of the Unionist Party. You see through a world war. You turf out the last Liberal Prime Minister. You climb the greasy pole and get to the top of the greasy pole, and then 6 months later, actually less than 6 months later, well, you're terminally ill. Bonar Law is known as the Unknown Prime Minister. That's the title of a biography by Robert Blake. But I'll try to make him a bit more known if I can. Although it's not easy. What can we say about him in the very brief period he's been Prime Minister? Well, I mean, probably the biggest thing is to have agreeing to disagree. Just agreeing to disagree with the French over the Ruhr, which is probably not as easy as we might think. So he did that. Also, the negotiation of the debt deal with the Americans. Now, that's something that's sort of lost to history, but it has been described in the pages of the Times as the biggest financial transaction in history, and will, certainly if you read Murray Rothbard's account of the Great Depression, will have all sorts of rather unpleasant consequences further down the road. Although I think the deal itself is, well, there's nothing wrong with it, so there's not much wrong with it, certainly not from a British point of view. I did report on him facing down the demonstration of the unemployed. That's a communist front stunt, and I think quite correctly he told him to get knotted. Although I think he might have had a meeting with them later on. I'm not quite sure about that. Frankly, I think his biggest failure is probably to fold when it comes to removing rent controls more later. But that's about it. That's about all we can say about his time in office. Nothing spectacular, nothing particularly awful about it. Also, on the Tuesday was the announcement of the death of Sarah Bernhardt. If you've heard of her, well, you'll know was a famous French actress. I mean, you think a French actress would just be famous in France, but no, I mean, Sarah Bernhardt was famous pretty much everywhere. So a lot of people are upset about that. On Wednesday, an interesting, interesting to me, case in the courts. Now, if you've ever heard of Oscar Wilde, which you probably have, you will have heard of Lord Alfred Douglas, his paramour and downfall. So what did Lord Alfred Douglas do next? Well, here's an example. I'm going to start with this paragraph. I don't expect you to understand it, but just to give an example of how legal cases were reported at the time, here goes. Hope you concentrate. This was an application by the defendants, the Morning Post Limited, for leave to appeal against an order of Mr. Justice Swift in Chambers, allowing an appeal from an order of Master Whately, hope you're following this, directing the plaintiff to make further and better answers to interrogatories in an action brought by Lord Alfred Douglas against the Morning Post for damages for alleged libel, which I think means it's an appeal against a preliminary procedure in advance of a full-blown trial. Anyway, it gets more interesting. One of these, Douglas's inventions, was what he called Jutland treachery, that referred to the Battle of Jutland. In his articles concerning that, the plaintiff said that a gang of Jewish financiers had made a profit of £18 million by having obtained control in the British Admiralty of the wireless news and signals which were being sent out to the British fleet. And it doesn't get any better. This purports to come from an intelligence officer. What Lord Kitchener must realise is that this war was planned by the Jews, caused by the Jews, and is fought for the purpose of drawing out the Jewish race. So, prominent figures indulging themselves in wild conspiracy theories. Couldn't happen today. Just for background, the point about Kitchener was he was the Minister of War at the outset of the First World War, and he died in 1916. He was on a mission to Russia. He boarded the HMS Hampshire. It went out, it hit a mine, and almost everyone died, including Kitchener, and his body has never been found. Thursday brought a story about some new underground trains that the, United Electric Railways of London, UERL, were introducing. Not particularly interesting as in terms of the trains themselves. I could look it up. I'm sure we could track down and pin down precisely what trains these were. What was interesting about this was how these things were built, in that the UERL went out to some train builders, said, build us a train, see what you think it should be like, and we'll build a train of our own, and we'll compare them and see which ones works. As it happens, the UERL train was the one they wanted. Now that might be because because of what people in the rail industry still call NIH, not invented here. But I think it whatever the case is, I think it illustrates a principle about any business. Almost is it. Even if you contract something out, it's a good idea to understand what you're contracting out, or have some understanding of what you're contracting out, as a way of doing things. It also brought the news, Thursday that is, also brought the news of the death of General Mallory. In case you haven't heard of the guy, he was a French general, and he was the general of the 6th Army at the Battle of the Marne. This was the army, in case you're familiar with this, that was on the extreme left of the French line and was, or would have, attacked the flank of the German army had the Germans not decided to retreat. There was also an article on Thursday on housing policy. This is what it has to say. That decontrol, as in decontrol of rents, will be suspended may be taken for granted, and it is not now likely that the policy announced by the government during the Mitcham by-election of decontrolling certain houses next year, unless a resolution to the contrary is carried by either House of Parliament, will be further proceeded with. The present indication is that it will be decided that the control of all houses shall be contrived until about April 1925, when the whole question will be reviewed in the light of the progress made with the provision of houses. Or to put it another way, the government has lost some by-elections and they're not going to end the freeze on rents, which is going to have some fairly serious consequences, as rent control always does. And I have this awful feeling that rent control didn't end until the 1980s. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think it did. And I think it's worth pointing out here that prior to the First World War, the vast majority of people, I think it's something like 80%, lived in rented accommodation. The idea of home ownership didn't... well, it's about to take off. And of course... by the 1980s, it was 50, 60%, something like that. I'll just look that one up. But I'm not going to. It goes on. Under the Addison scheme, 176,000 houses have been built, and state aid has been given in other ways towards the erection of another 40,000 houses. I presume this is the sort of baby steps that British governments always take before you get full government control. I'm not quite sure what the Addison scheme is. It's some form of council housing, I'm sure. There's then another section on encouraging home ownership, and it includes this quote: "One more house owner, one less potential Bolshevist," which for most of the rest of the century was a conservative, well, not so much slogan, but watchword. Well, you kind of, it's not a watchword, it's not a word, watch phrase, if such a thing as this, but a maxim. That's it, maxim. I mean, it's awfully cynical, you'd have to say, and it's not necessarily a good thing. If people were renting in such huge numbers before the war, there are probably good reasons why they were renting. Maybe because they couldn't afford anything else. Maybe because of the flexibility. Because if you get a job somewhere else, maybe it's a good idea to move. Why that would be, I don't know. I don't know. Yes, I do, because you want to go for another job. Don't be stupid, Patrick. Also on Thursday, there was in the photograph section. At this time in the Times' history, there's one page given over to photographs. And there's an image of the proposed Verdun Memorial, which is, from what my knowledge or my memory, is very close to what actually came about. On Saturday, there was an article about Irish migration to Scotland. See if any of the sentiments sound familiar to you. The Reverend J. McLagan, speaking at the Glasgow Established Church Presbytery today, on what he said was good authority, declared that the Roman Catholic Irish in the city, in proportion to their number, were 3 times as productive of crime as the remainder of the population. Immigration from the Irish Free State, he said, had been and was still going on extensively to the serious detriment of the Scottish working classes, and Scottish youth was compelled to emigrate at the rate of 30,000 a year. He went on. The immigrants to Scotland from the Irish Free State were, he submitted, inferior socially and on a lower scale industrially, intellectually, morally and spiritually. The presbytery must give a lead and make their country fit of decent Scots to live in. So how did all that work out? It's worth pointing out that Irish immigration to Glasgow had been going on for a while, long before 1923. That's why you got the establishment of Celtic Football Club in 1888. Now, obviously, when it comes to football, Glasgow is very much a divided city. Whether it is divided in other ways, I don't know, although it doesn't sound like a good start, shall we say. Anyway, that's all for this week. I hope to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.